parish administration is on the syllabus. I'm not sure how much and how far it could really be examined. It's certainly, I would doubt if it could really stretch to a whole question. Not least because the more interesting issues are perhaps a little bit too vague and too political to lend themselves to a actual legal paper question, which is, what is the role, what is the point of having a different role for parishes in a small island in the modern world? I mean, on Jersey, they've, as part of the reorganisation, they set up a department of the states called the Customer and Local Services Department, which is a very odd name. I mean, if you set aside the Orwellian nature of calling citizens customers, local services on the island of Jersey are actually dealt with by the parishes by definition. But so the whole concept of what is a local service, if someone comes from the UK, they would look at Jersey and Guernsey and see many of the things which are local government functions being carried out naturally by the central government. So why is there then this particular subdivision in Jersey into 12 and Guernsey into 10 to have local administrations? And it's really to a large extent for historical purposes and for tradition. And there's actually nothing inherently wrong with organising your government based on popular sentiment as to where your units of identity are. In England and Wales, and actually in the UK as a whole, Great Britain as a whole, when they abolished lots of the old local counties and replaced them with far more efficient units of administration back in the 1970s, most people thought, this is absolutely awful. I want Rutland back. It's great. It's historic. It's got about 30,000 people in it. But how dare they make it a borough of or a sub part of Leicestershire? We're not Leicestershire. We're Rutland. What is Avon? What is Tyne and Tees? And who the hell is Merseyside when there's Liverpool there? So the idea of that things should be organised efficiently, as opposed from according to how people identify, is a social debate in itself, and one which I don't really think it would be particularly good to have a long question on. Certainly, I don't think you can really support a question that does anything more than acknowledge the tension between efficiency and tradition, which is that's a mark. I mean, how are you going to get up to 20 marks in parish administration? I don't know, unless you start asking people stuff about the different routes to local taxation and going through all those technical details until you've got 20 marks worth. But then the extent of knowledge that you're going to have to get, rote learning, is rather prohibitive. And I would add, pointless. Anyway, parishes, 10 parishes of ecclesiastical origin. Each parish has an assembly called the douzaine. Hence, at times, this is very bad if you're trying to write a study guide and you don't come from Guernsey, parish and douzaine seem to be used interchangeably. The original popular element of the states of deliberation was provided by parish representatives, originally the constables, later representatives of the douzaine. 2004, parish representatives were moved from states of deliberation. As there's no arguments about bringing parish representatives back to the states of deliberation, we can't do the favourite Jersey question, which is to ask about should constables be in the states of Jersey, which is a live question, and the debates and the arguments are all very well available and live, but there is no equivalent in Guernsey, so that is old history. Funded by the occupiers and owners rate. again, there's a lot of detail in some of the study notes that were circulated before about the different ways in which parish funding was done. I would really hope, again, that that's not going to serve the whole question, or you're going to have an extraordinarily bad exam. And that's what I would say.
Just to really briefly digress. Do you know when you might know about who's setting the exams on the other side of the time?
No. I think the difficulty is there's a division in who's actually taking the day-to-day practical leads of people such as Gordon and William, and who's actually going to sign off at the very top, who in this paper, certainly the bailiff, as it's called, the Bailiffs Paper. And we don't, I'm not cited on the clear decision making. When I was originally approached, one of the things which is in the contract is what I would get for marking exam papers. I don't even know if I'm going to be marking the exam papers. I've also got something about setting the exam, and I'll certainly ask for feedback about the previous questions on it, which was a polite, slightly sugar-coated version of what I've been saying in these lessons. But again, I don't know how much I'm actually going to be involved, and I entirely sympathise with you that it's not a very satisfactory position. There are several months to go, and what I will say to you is that most of the hard learning to really is done in the study period. If we don't know at the start of the study period that you have, whatever length of time you're given by your respective firms, if you don't know then, we have a big problem. If you don't know now, you don't have a big problem, because now is really setting the groundwork so that when you begin that period, you're not trying to learn it afresh. There will be bells in the head, like, you know, he said such and such a thing. I can vaguely remember such a thing. That it's in the study guide somewhere. So general familiarity with the study guide, with the concepts, is what you're really trying to build up now. But yeah, if we get to April and we still don't have an answer, if you get into the exam room and you start to think, oh, that type of paper, that would have been interesting to know. I might as well sign my name on the top and just take 3 hours break, you know. That's no, because if you get set an entirely different, if you get set a rote learning paper, then you haven't studied for a rote learning paper, you studied for a conceptual paper, one where you'll be doing essay questions, where you're going to be delivering ideas and the bits of knowledge bring those ideas to life. That's a very different form of learning. Alternatively, you know, for example, Mel Thomas, who does the succession, and she's a lovely lady and a really good teacher. And she says, and it's her words, so it's not my words, okay? She says that when it comes to setting exams, she is a bitch, okay? Because she asks for the entire study guide. She says you can't leave anything out because it could leave you stranded on any question. And what's more, you're not going to get the various statutes, and she does want the article numbers, paragraph numbers, subparagraph numbers, okay? Now, you can only do that if it's appropriate to the paper that's sufficiently limited number of provisions, and you've told in advance. It's doable, and you know, people get good marks in that paper, and nobody failed the paper. Actually, nobody soared in the paper, but nobody failed the paper. But they knew what was expected of them, and unless you know what's expected of you, it's just not. It wouldn't be fair to set that as to have that approach without telling people. Having told people, it's what they call harsh but fair. Particularly, she has long experience of doing that and people passing. But she is an absolutely lovely lady, but she does seem to revel in being really tough on this particular issue. Okay? So, 3 parts of the parish administration. The douzaine or parish committees. That's what the douzaine is. It's the parish committee. is elected by the parishioners. The constables. Now, in Jersey, the constables, they are the president, the el presidente of the parish. They are the embodiment of it. They are the kings and queens in their own little fiefdom. The procureurs. Now, they still have a role in the relief of absolute poverty. Essentially, it's a role that's been allowed to continue because it's seemed to have use. But it's essentially a throwback to when poor relief was on the parishes, which disappeared in England, but I suppose totally with the creation of the welfare state. And in the Channel Islands, sometime in the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, very recent. I mean, people still retain their proctors before, but that's more sort of additional hardship on the social security system was restructured around 2004-ish, which absorbed what was parish relief. I mean, particularly for unemployed people, when you had exceeded your number of weeks eligibility for unemployment benefit, then there was some provision for parish relief. But it's now very much that sort of bad of cotton, bad of coal, really past it.
It's like running a food bank.
Yes,
like
yes,
but
it's really it's only instituted that there is any proper administration.
So Duzen, in charge of parish administration, tends to meet monthly. I actually expect there are 12 members in the Duzen, except sometimes there are 16 for the big ones.
16 for the detached part of Vale, and 20 is the people.
The detached part of the Vale.
Yeah. It's what was and St Peter Port has 20 on the basis of late 19th century being a very cosmopolitan part of the island and needing more.
Urban Guernsey.
Yes.
So the members are Duzeniers, 6-year terms. Again, you can see that you can ask a question on, about 2 marks, you could imagine, on how the Duzeniers elected, and you just say 6-year terms. I suppose it's 1/6 elected every year. It's on a rolling basis.
I mean, some of them really elected for several years to make up years.
I think perhaps one of the important works is that if you cease to live in the parish, your office immediately ceases. So there would be a by-election, and there is a quirky provision that if that seat falls vacant late September, early October, they can wait till the annual November, December, and run a replacement. So that could be the sort of thing that appears in the question that actually the Duzenier of the camp or the constable will be a quirk in the question that they makes it clear they're no longer living in the parish. That's fine. Well, they've got no office, they can't hold office.
Do you have it that people don't realise they're no longer living in the parish? Because we had a problem when somebody's nominations papers were signed by somebody who'd moved 1 street down, didn't realise that she was in a new constituency.
General elections, we've had 2 problems where the regular nominated people into people on the wrong side of the people we invited into. The rest are parish
How
boundary.
did you deal with that, by the way?
Well, then to go and
So you got it before they were actually elected.
Yes.
Oh yes.
Someone had checked before we,
Yeah, because we had somebody who was elected, and then they found out the problem, and then it was decided that it wouldn't actually invalidate the election because that was just a little bit silly. And the ones who actually challenged it were no hopers.
Presumably you just get somebody who does live in the parish.
Well, the thing is that
you
well, it's already gone, you know. So, and they had difficulties. They had one person that they had problems with a political party, and you meant to be on your nomination that you were of that party, and then the person didn't put it on the nomination form. And one person says, "Oh, I didn't actually know they were of that party. He hadn't told me then. Oh, it's no problem, but there's a technical error." And then one happened twice, and one of the candidates said, "No, I'm out of here," and the other one said, "I'm standing my ground." So the constables basically, I think the executive officer is the person who has the permanent presence. I suppose it's almost like a chief executive role, isn't it? Or the person who's actually just in charge because they're
the importance
would they be in the office on a day every day, or do you like have an office staff and the constable might occasionally float in?
It varies from parish to parish. Forest have the least occupied office between 4 and 6 p.m. on a Wednesday before Saturday. Whereas people is open Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Constables tend to take a more active role in the country parishes, and are usually not also prisoners in the Queen's Court, Stamford, Castle, constables, and also tend to be prisoners.
So is it an
I don't think it's going to the only sort of remuneration benefit they get is that their Christmas bash is covered from their money derived from ornaments.
For example, some people work in office,
Yeah.
being open.
So
Presumably that's staff.
that's what we start. They've got that. Some parts and all stuff.
Is that funded at the parish level?
Yes, and you're promoting those.
I think probably there's more parish administration going on in New Jersey because
Yes, Jersey parishes are more organised of policing.
you don't have an honorary police.
No.
So you don't have 13 police forces for a small island. But the constable has these roles. It's an honorary appointment, but presumably much of them in St. Peter Port will be done by the permanent paid staff, and the constable is just there to give such time. Presumably, it's a job for a retired person, isn't it? Because because in Jersey, because they're members of the states, they get paid the salary of the state's member, but they do tend to be people who are much older, at least in their 50s, because they would have worked their way through the honorary service, and that's how they get to be known well enough to put their name forward as constable when somebody retires. Procurers we dealt with for effectively its local charity, form of poor law function. So these are the current functions, which are
Just one thing to add. The deans of the saying who that's the longest serving member on each of the things. They are they're appointed by office as members of under the
Complaints.
Administrative Decisions Review Board legislation. It's the only sort of kind of role for the six of the agreements with them, and then you have the green agreements, which is the most senior.
So you're an Amazon,
Yes.
longest serving. Then I have a role on the.
Yes, so you could be called on a review board, and if you are human beings, current practices, that you will be deputy chairman of the panel members.
How do you become a dean of teams?
You just manage as a staff.
Buggins' turn.
Oh, you start, John. Always, you must start.
Become the chairman of what?
Deputy chair of the panel of members for the under the administrative review legislation.
Okay. So these are the general functions, and again, you can't see that you need to learn them, although keeping pigs in St Peter Port's quite jolly, isn't it? Refuse collection is probably the most important, isn't it?
At the moment, but the how probably worth being familiar with the corrective administration ordinance, in respect of refuse collection, cutting of hedges and clearing of streams. There is provision under that legislation for the issuing of civil penalty notices and an appellate function. Yeah, I'll put that consolidated.
That gives them the powers to issue these letters for you not putting your hedge.
Yes.
Yeah, I think yeah, I mean, we'll sit down, what is this? Because great music with my friends in England. Yeah. Well, that's just like a driving traffic. Yeah. Like driving.
So, sorry, do you think with the current functions is running the polls and the parish elections with island-wide voting, do you think they'll still be running the island-wide voting but in parish, so you go vote in your current parish?
From a practical point of view, I would hope they would, because it makes our running of elections very cheap. Yeah, because they pull in loads of volunteers at no cost. But the difficulty is that I suspect people will, they will, if it's island-wide voting, I should be able to go to the polling station most convenient to myself rather than have to go to one in my parish. So, I think that's pretty well, it takes some gentle and persuasive negotiations.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, relationship with the states of Guernsey, are the parishes in search of a role? So, debate since about 2000, which I suppose is when they removed, let's say, a unit of election to the actual states of liberation itself. So you end the concept that these are communities which require community representation in the decision making of the island. And after which the question is, so what is the point of them? if you're all Guernsey, why is it divided up in this way? You're actually dealing with some fairly humdrum sort of functions. So in 2007, get the Guernsey Douzaine Council to discuss common concerns, seek consistency in work, essentially to try and promote the idea that they actually are useful, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, they're still very sore about using the Douzaines losing seats in states as the Douzaine representatives. So the Douzaine would appoint one of their number, and they have the same speaking and voting rights as deputies. And it's, they rather shot themselves in the foot. You know, it was out of the Sunday trading debate, all the stuff that come out in the 2002, where the vote was clearly going for to allow for Sunday trading. The Douzaine representatives were always last on the roll vote, and secondly, the vote swung so that it was lost by a narrow margin, and all the Douzaine reps voted against Sunday trading, and some state members took umbrage at that and said that just shows that they have got the best interest of the island and they studied up, and that was sort of the final. Yes, how little things suddenly change thinking. Yeah, and public things actually, you know, we go to England, it's lovely, you know, shopping on Sunday, and that's great.
You reckon that's what led to the 2004?
It was one of the things that like, yeah, there'd been a bit of feeling that they weren't representative because most had not stood in a contested election in their parish, and even if they had, parish election turnouts are, if you get 5% you've got turnout, you've done very well.
I mean, the strange thing is that in Jersey, it's often the case that the constables turn the votes, and often they, particularly in the last administration, they were, apart from a few of them, they were very much almost like a payroll vote for the government side. But when they had a referendum attached to the 2014 election, the vote was heavily in favour of keeping the constables. But then the constable has that sort of presence, isn't it? Whereas I suppose if a Douzaine is just a council, it's like an indirect election of who is going to represent you. Might not be quite so emotional.
It had seen its time, and the parishes didn't you just moan and didn't come back with an alternative approach, so that possibly something like the ordinary representative, or can we have five Douzaine reps, and that will be an elected post or something. They didn't come up with an alternative. We'll go into a 7-district one per district. So that they rather known rather than
Well, and now we go to the parish meetings and notice that there's no link with the deputies and they're trying to somehow install whatever.
It will come on to the Douzaine liaison group, which is a sort of often one's have to try and get some support.
And here is the Douzaine liaison group.
The Douzaine liaison group, it's a function that policy and resources provide. So they meet 2 times a year. Each of the Douzaines sends a representative. A representative of the Guernsey Douzaine Council also comes along, and there are 4 deputies appointed to also vote on it. And it's basically, it's one of those meetings where it's a bit of an opportunity for them to have a bit of a moan and groan, but also, I mean, the last couple of years it's been dominated by introducing them to the new refuse arrangements. It's quite, I find it quite helpful. I was doing the referendum as a way of sort of keeping them on board by engaging with them early, making them feel loved and wanted. So it's a bit of a.
Were you attending?
Yes, I was going along doing these. And it's an opportunity for them to raise issues, raise things to discuss. More recently in St. Peter Port, when the building in the borders that needed to was kept building that needed was dangerous to be brought down. It does a liaison group. It's one of the functions that sits under the team I look after. So essentially, graduate planning to come along and talk the relationship between the preservation notices and that under the planning law that could be used against a dangerous building and stuff. The constable can go and decide if the building is dangerous and which action needs to be taken. So
It doesn't do much, is what they're saying.
this is it. It doesn't do much other than keeps the appearance of communication.
For those of you who like ancient history, maybe it's a bit like when the emperors took all the power away from the senators, but they would still stand up for the consuls because the consuls were formerly, the important power. You acknowledge somebody's importance, but you don't necessarily give them any importance. So, but again, it would be very different in Jersey, but that's not really what concerns you. And that is where it is at the moment. The parishes have some roles, but increasingly not. Increasingly, matters get centralised because a lot of things are more efficient if run from St. Peter Port. I mean, there are some things, we go back to the list. Dog licenses, it's quite good to be able to get your dog license just quite locally. But then when you're running an efficiency organisation, you'd probably say, well, actually, whoever's stamping the dog license, you've got 10 people stamping the dog license, and you could probably only have, one person who occasionally comes out from behind a till to stamp a dog license in St. Peter Port. I don't know if your reorganisation is trying to do a one front door policy for Guernsey.
There's been some quite significant moves towards that.
Because the logic which actually will probably the one thing which would lead to a sudden swing politically would be if the one front door idea was applied to say, well, what about bringing parish services within that one front door? Suddenly things would change immensely in Jersey terms, but maybe not in Guernsey because you've already largely,
I think this is the second year where parishes haven't been able to fill enough candidates to fill all the vacancies. It's really important to run a by-election, trying to fill one vacancy in the same last year. It is getting difficult to find what people willing to volunteer. It's one of those things that they like meeting, but actually meeting once a month to discuss the VA when you haven't got somebody to be expressing your voice. You're hoping that one of the parochial deputies will turn up and You know, in their speech, saying, I was at the meeting for Adele, very happy with these proposals, or very unhappy with them. Is less certain than when you had your Brazilian rep, who was there to reflect the views of the parish. It's become, it's one of those, there are lots of ways the parishes could be much more effective and proactive, but it needs probably a bit of a cheering out of some of the longer serving members. That sort of change of attitude and approach.
Okay, let's move on to judicial review. Now we get into an interesting subject, jurisprudentially, and one in which if a bailiff is minded to have problem questions, this will be quite a good area. Now get into an area which is really about, this is probably the one area where we start getting into substantive law on this particular paper. So it's judicial review and other means of challenge, because it's not just judicial review that we're interested in. And we'll get on to the Administrative Complaints Board as well. Now, judicial review is not the only means to challenge government. If government breaks the law, you can sue it. So if you get wrongly arrested, you can sue for false imprisonment. There are lots of areas where statute creates a tribunal or creates a right of appeal to the royal courts. You have this case from 1983, the House of Lords case of Wandsworth and Winder, which basically means that if the state, in that case the local government, tries to impose some duty on you unlawfully, in that case it was an unlawful increase in rents or rates by a borough council, you can simply say, I'm not going to pay it. I'm not going to challenge the legality of this. You can come to me and sue me for the money, and then I will raise your illegality as a defence. Which actually is very powerful, because what it means is that if there is no statutory right of appeal against some duty imposed on you by statute, you can actually sit and wait for the government to come to you. You don't actually have to bring a judicial review. I'd say that in my career as a litigator, I've had 3 bad defeats, and one of them was very much on that principle. But you take out of it the idea that as a government department, give people a right of appeal. It stops them from being able to judicially review. It stops them from being able to challenge a decision later on. But there is always a way of challenging illegality, because that's what the rule of law means. Which is why when Dicey was able to say about the British Constitution that the rule of law was one of the 2 keystones of the 2 fundamental principles of the British Constitution, precisely because there was always a remedy for illegality, and this was long before anybody had ever talked the word judicial review in a modern sense. But judicial review is the principal one, as lawyers we get taught about, that we need to know about. Firstly, it's a remedy of last resort. It is ousted by more specific remedies, for example, statutory appeals. So, income tax, you get assessed. It's true in Guernsey under your 1975 law, true Jersey's 61 law, true in the UK under the Taxes Management Act of 1970. You get assessed, you have a right of appeal. You don't use that right of appeal. 30 days lapses, 14 perhaps hearing, whatever the time of appeal lapses, your assessment is final, due and payable. You get sued for the money. You turn up in court and say, I think this is terrible. I never earned that income. This is an unreasonable assessment. And the court will say, it's final, due and payable. You have an appeal right. You don't use the appeal right, it's gone. It's final, due, payable. You go to the Royal Court to try and judicially review the decision to come after you. Try and judicially review the assessment. And the court will say, well, did you have an appeal right? And if the answer is yes, then you can't do, then they'll say you can't judicially review the decision. So you can only get a judicial review if there's no other remedy, no other claim that you could make. So if you have an action for false imprisonment, you can't judicially review as a way around that. Certainly not if you want to get damages. You can only sort of judicially review in areas where there's a right of appeal if the thing you're complaining about isn't covered by the right of appeal. So if the person in charge of income tax says, I agree, you do not owe, if you do X, I cannot assess you. And then next year you fill in your tax return and the controller says, I've actually thought about that again. And actually that is assessable, so I'm going to assess you. And you say, well, then I'll appeal that assessment. And the person in charge of income tax will then reply, but you can't appeal it, because the appeal is only interested in your legal liabilities, and you're legally liable. And then you can say, but I can judicially review it, because what you're doing is unreasonable. It's may not be covered by your right of appeal, but it's unreasonable, it's an abuse of power, therefore I will turn up in the Royal Court with a judicial review. And you'd be able to do that, because what you're arguing is not subject to the right of appeal. And a lot of this, I mean, it's not just because I'm actually an ex-revenue lawyer, so everything I know, well, a lot of what I know about judicial review comes from tax, but actually tax has often been the driving side of this particular area of judicial review. Imported to Guernsey by the judiciary, Bassington and HM Procureur. So hooray, we had a Guernsey case to cite on actual substantive Guernsey law. We've not had much of in this particular paper. It's easy to import because at the heart of it is the simple concept that if something is illegal, there should be a remedy. And if the remedy isn't provided elsewhere, then it should be possible for the court to say to the government, no, you have to do X, you mustn't do Y. The law says such and such a thing, please take notice of that, or we'll be back here very shortly. Now, in England, it's derived largely from basic principles, separation of powers, which obviously creates different issues in Guernsey as it would do in England and Wales, which we talked about earlier. We talked about the Bowlaw and Larson case from the Jersey Court of Appeal, that there isn't a separation of legislature executive as regards certain ordinance-making powers, certain what in England would be seen as secondary legislation, and executive acts are actually acts of the legislature here. So things are a bit different, but not entirely different. And the rule of law, the fundamental principle of the government's act in the law, is the basic principle of judicial review, the most important. It only applies to public agencies. So here you would be looking at English case law, because much of judicial review essentially has imported, without necessarily putting in any sort of rules, the English principles of it. If you have a regulatory body carrying out public type functions of an industry, so it's the data vim case in financial services, it can still be a public body. If it's something which is doing a function which has to be done by the state, if it wasn't being done by this other body, then it's quite possibly going to be a public function. So if you have in this case, a regulator of something which is going to need to be regulated by the state in any case, then it might be viewed as a public function. On the other hand, if the jockey club, you can't judicially review the jockey club because if horse racing didn't regulate itself, the state wouldn't step in and regulate a sport. It's up to sport to regulate sport. It's not a public area. So you can't judicially review the jockey club, you can't judicially review the Football Association setting up the Premier League. There are limits to what can be a public function. So basic grounds, and this comes back to what you learned, those of you who did English, and I'm sure Canadian. None of you did Canadian law degrees. Did anyone do other common law jurisdictions? Australian? And I doubt that you've got the same grounds for basic judicial review. Oh, good. So you've probably got similar grounds for the basics of judicial review. Constitutional review in Canada obviously is a different question, and so we don't have that here. Although actually, when you get to the Human Rights Act, a lot of stuff, Canada is actually the jurisdiction it's most looked to by the UK courts. See, I didn't know there was another Canadian.
I'm not Canadian, I'm Guernsey, but
Yes.
funny long route. No, so I went initially on the Brock scholarship.
Okay, so illegality. So that just says what it means. And this is the if you want a case, it's the GCHQ case, which gives you the most of the citations. The fundamental principles. Illegality, you're acting outside your powers. The law says you can do A, B, and C, and you're actually doing D. Unreasonableness. Now, this is the terribly controversial case if you're an academic these days and you don't like the limitations on courts to intervene in administrative acts. But this is the Wednesbury case was to do with the licensing of cinemas. And it was a decision by a council not to allow cinemas to open, to allow young people to watch it on a Sunday, back in the 1940s, which seems terribly unreasonable nowadays, but in actual fact, the whole purpose of the act was to kick the can down the road when it came to religious objections to various forms of entertainment being open on a Sunday, and to basically allow local councils to make that sort of decision. So the phrase which came out of that was, is a decision so unreasonable that no decision maker will make it? So it's quite a high hurdle, even if it's an entirely circular definition. It also shows, which you'll find the Laker Airways case is the principal citation, you look to the legislation to decide in the first instance what is unreasonable. What is the scheme of the legislation? What is the legislation getting at? Because if the purpose of the legislation is to allow councils to make a thumbs up or thumbs down on particular forms of Sunday entertainment, then that is an entirely different issue to trying to take a general power of licensing and import local religious principles, which were never really the purpose of the actual statute. If you have for example, to take, although not the human rights element of it, to take the wonderful misbehaving case, if you have a statute which is meant to allow a council to make a decision should it even allow sex shops to be open, then it becomes quite reasonable to say no sex shops. On the other hand, if you have a statute whose purpose is to regulate those which are opened in an area, then it becomes unreasonable to eliminate all of them. So the statutory scheme has to be considered. Not just a pure, is this a good idea in a generic sense, that may often be what it comes down to. Procedural impropriety. Bias, obviously, a difficult issue in a small community. You're meant to find somebody who's entirely unaffected, doesn't know anybody. It can actually lead to ridiculous results, this lack of bias, because in England and Wales, if you're elected to a council to represent a specific issue in your specific ward, you can then have to be required to recuse yourself when that issue actually gets debated, because obviously you've got an interest in it, but that's what you're elected for, so you can get to that, take things too far. Ex audi partem, even God asked Adam for an explanation, is the easy way of explaining this. To those of you who have read or watched a version of Tom Jones, Squire Allworthy always asks for an explanation before condemning, no matter how obvious the matter is. A great rule that we all know in our real lives, but actually we tend to leap to conclusions and shout at people without finding out the facts. But this is essentially that idea. Failure to observe statutory procedures. It's worth looking at a case called Sonegi, one of my favourite cases. The consequences of failure to observe statutory procedures are a matter of construing the statute itself. This particularly has happened in confiscation cases, because confiscation, you tend to have a very pedantic series of procedures for what you have to take. And so what happens if a decision takes 100 days rather than 90 days to make? Does that mean that Chumley is off the hook? So then it was actually very difficult to actually decide that. So they swept away any idea of, is a rule directive or mandatory? I said, well, it's a matter of statutory construction as to what the concept would be. And usually the idea wouldn't be to allow somebody to go free from sanctions and allow a law to become inoperative because somebody had fallen ill and the decision wasn't taken for a day later.
Just on bias, Deputy Bailiff recently in appeal on the floor from a employment discrimination tribunal case. Into quite some detail about, well, although it wasn't actually a ground of appeal, he allowed the appeal on the basis that there is a serious risk of sexual bias, Cottrell versus employment discrimination.
What's the name?
Cottrell.
Is it on the GMI?
Yes, it is. So again, I'll make sure it's added up. And basically in that one, the convener of the employment discrimination panel, though not sitting as a member of the tribunal, on that occasion he worked in HR at Board of Health. Cottrell was down from the Board of Health still talking old man. The dismissing her and the discrimination convener was part of the team presenting Claire's case and her real presence there. Organisations like Care big enough to be able to find somebody else, and the tribunal members could have felt influenced because their convener was there to reach a decision that she was potentially going to be content with. But he goes into quite some, it's quite helpful for getting a feel as to how certain deputy bailiff is balanced and biased.
Presumably,
It's very easy to get
presumably the appeal tribunal is the finder of fact, because often in the case law, it doesn't matter if you have a bias problem or procedural issue at lower down, if you have an appeal to someone who finds the facts or the relevant facts afresh. So, because usually if you have like an internal appeal, like you have with redetermining officers in social security, the redetermining officer should be senior to, or at least in a different line management chain to the determining officer, because it's quite embarrassing to have to redetermine something that your superior officer has done. So that would be really, really bad if those findings of fact were the findings of fact that go forward, and the challenge is only on the reasonableness basis. If, on the other hand, you can appeal on the grounds of the facts, that the tribunal has to find entirely new facts for itself, that bias doesn't matter, that procedural problem doesn't matter, because you've got a new layer of decision making. So again, it comes down to, if you have a full appeal right, it tends to oust these sort of principles and these sort of issues insofar as they might have risen lower down. But yeah, it would be embarrassing if somebody who's part of your administration is going to be criticised.
It's quite difficult to run perception of bias arguments, especially in cases of accusal, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because very often in the criminal matrimonial court systems, the judges are sitting on two separate cases or having previously found against one witness that now attends as a defendant.
But there's no problem. I mean, a fair-minded person wouldn't say there was a problem with the same judge carrying through a hearing, and just because, I mean, if you could all do it in one case, you'd find against them completely, and that would be nice and neat. In fact, you found against somebody on an earlier thing doesn't stop you from being the person who hears the later parts later on. What you can't do is sit on and hear the appeal. Now, historically, in the 17th century, you'd have judges who'd, as barristers, had pleaded a case and then sit on the panel later on when they've been kicked upstairs. But that obviously doesn't happen these days. Lack of consultation all depends. Again, how do you find out that somebody needs to be consulted? You look at the statute. It may be implicit. It may be obvious that it's unreasonable to act without consulting people. So when in Jersey, the Law Society decided that it was going to change the legal aid system almost overnight, the lack of notice, lack of consultation of that became a ground for seeking judicial review, notwithstanding that there was nothing in any statute that required consultation. It can be fairly obvious. On the other hand, you may have different legal areas where it may be nice to consult, but it's not necessarily something's going to happen. It can be quite reasonable not to consult because you have to act quickly.
One I was involved with about 2000-ish. The division as bailiff held that the prison was arguing that he hadn't been prison advisors hadn't given them the guidance notes as to what happens with a parole application, but she didn't know the criteria for the parole consideration. And the bailiff's ruling was that actually these criteria, although they aren't embodied in the statute in Guernsey, adopted from the parole board in the UK, they've been published in a policy letter. So they've been made public. They were covered in a guidance note. The fact that she hadn't been given the guidance note, she'd been given something else that told her in the guidance note, she hadn't asked for it. So I think helpful as part of consultation, actually something having been made public through what the FEA can carry through, depending on whether or not it's something that, that of itself can be sufficient to get it into the public domain as that's the lowest part of consultation that we've made. That was rightly versus parole union.
Now, are there further grounds for judicial review? One is proportionality, which will be raised in EU and ECHR cases quite legitimately. And this is one where the UK Supreme Court, was the UK House of Lords, essentially took from Canada its 4-stage test. The case of Huang is the UK case, which is perhaps best used. Though actually there's lots of cases on it. HUANG. Is there a legitimate aim? Is the measure rationally connected to that aim? Least intrusive means, which actually is really where the heart and soul of most proportionality tests are, is whether or not it's possible to identify or at least speculate that there would be a better way of achieving the ends, which would be less harmful to rights. Problem here, as recognised in some comment on the Aguila-Quilla case, is that a lot of government measures are inherently speculative. You don't know whether they're going to work or not work. So how can you be entirely sure that there's an alternative means that will work better? Is it proportionate in the general balance sense? Is it a hammer to crack a nut? That's Aguila-Quilla is a good case on that. Now, in a way, it could very easily end up with what's called full merits review, in that, logically speaking, if there is such a thing as a least intrusive means, and there is only one least intrusive means, there should actually be only one solution which would solve this particular, which would actually be proportionate. Now, the courts avoid this particular problem by giving what's called a margin of discretion. In ECHR terms, margin of appreciation, but that's because it's for different countries. The margin of discretion or judicial deference is another expression, which is been imported from Canada, but many people don't like the expression, which basically says the court will defer to the value judgments of the policy maker, of the legislature, to a degree. It won't replace its view on the importance of let's say, immigration control. It won't just say, well, we disagree with the idea of immigration control, or we think that immigration control is even more important. It will try not to impose its own value judgment on particularly issues of social policy. The difficulty with proportionality being used in all cases is it does rather assume that there's a presumption against acting in a particular way. So it's very useful for human rights cases where it's been developed, because there you have a starting point is you shouldn't infringe the right unless it's justified. So therefore, there is something where you have a starting point of you shouldn't do it. On the other hand, if you have a decision of whether you're going to allocate money to A rather than B, and what is reasonable and what isn't reasonable, it doesn't really lend itself to a proportionality analysis. It also becomes rather difficult if different rights point in a different direction, as can often be the case with freedom of speech and freedom of privacy. Freedom of speech and privacy. Anyway, you don't need to get deeply into that, you just need to know the rough outline of it. Legitimate expectation, bits out in the states of Guernsey, and it's very easy, particularly in a small jurisdiction, for people to ask questions, be given reassurance because our government tries to be helpful, and then for them to take away that reassurance and try and turn it into a full legal right. Anyway, we have procedural legitimate expectation, which is you're expected to take a certain process, and that's where this doctrine originated, and substantive, which is the government expected to give a certain result. So Bitchard was one of these cases when it related to enhancement of pension. And where substantive legitimate expectation arose originally was in a case from Torquay, when a local authority had promised an elderly lady that she'd be able to stay in her nursing home forever. And they were rather expecting that, the council probably expected that forever not to be too long. By the time she was 102, they wanted to close the nursing home, because they found it very inefficient. It would be a much It wasn't a good way of organising their resources, and they were told they couldn't do that. It is a good example of what is sometimes called little old lady justice, where an unfortunate decision results largely from natural sympathy to people who are little old ladies. And this principle of legitimate expectation creates actually undecided difficulties if the substantive expectation is for an illegal result. So, for example, if you are asking not to be assessed your correct amount of tax because of an assurance you've been given by the revenue. Remedies: quashing order, mandatory order, prohibitory order. Simple as what it says. Declaration of applicant's rights, less useful if you're the applicant, unless it's something that's going to be acted on in the future. You can get a stay or an injunction, but we don't have the problem of can you get an injunction against the Crown, because it's not, strictly speaking, the Crown, by and large. And damages normally not given in judicial review cases. Remedies are discretionary. So you can be in the position where you're trying to say, well, that decision was illegal, and could it go away? You might be told, well, you're too late to argue that. However, if the government's coming at you to try and get money off you, and you're raising the arguments of defence and enforcement proceedings, it's not a discretionary remedy. You're doing the Wandsworth and Winder context I talked about earlier. It's giving you your remedy is not discretionary. So if you can argue judicial review issues in a non-judicial review context, you're actually in a stronger position. So if you are too late in starting proceedings, if, as can happen, the decision is irreversible. So if you have a planning case and somebody has already built something on the basis of planning permission that shouldn't have been given, it's very late to very hard to try and raise a judicial review there. Obviously, in planning, normally there would be appeal rights. But it is the old government house case.
Yes, that's one of the planning laws. That's a third party appeal, and third party appeals against planning decisions will still come up with judicial review. Spelling of it, Gerhardt versus Environment is the most recent. That's 2015 case. That's GROU CUPP.
GROU
CUPP. That one is quite particularly helpful to go through. It's the practice direction locally requires you to bring the claim promptly, unlike the UK where you have a backstop of planning and within 3 months. Richard McMahon goes through this judgment. They've got quite some detail as to where he sees promptly falling.
Promptly should fall as being comparable to appeal deadlines in that particular area. In England, I always thought that within 3 months was there for declaration, because plenty of cases where people waited ages and ages and ages, and then just thought, oh well, there's no real prejudice, is there?
And the other thing we do, that case also online, a number of the other Bradley's the same couple of judicial cases. But very often locally the full case is heard, but the decision is that permission to proceed to judicial review wouldn't have been granted. That would be at first stage rather than the judicial review.
Yep.
They do come to
The commission stage with the full hearing.
yeah, it's two parts, one rather than I think it's felt that locally it's probably as good a use of court times. It probably takes
But we don't have the same amount of cases
Yeah,
with
it's
things
the-
where they need the permission.
yeah,
to filter
yeah.
rubbish ones.
Certainly,
Or the hopeless ones.
I think procedure, I think actually would be quite useful to actually go and look at that, because what I've got is practice direction. And the general view seems to be that you look to England if there's been development on.
Certainly, Deputy Bailiff is quite hot on the development of practice direction. Not least, I can't think of which. I was looking after it for a review committee many years ago and went through a stage where we had that sort of domino effect. One prisoner did it to JR, his parole decision, and another 6 followed. So I seem to be forever in court with Richard Mann was one of the litigators.
Prisoners are like that.
And he referred the then bailiff to the practice direction, and the Vic said, I know Advocate McMahon is very keen to follow the practice direction like some faithful puppy. Which, so I don't think it's quite recovered. So now I'm looking to the practice direction like the owner of that.
So procedure, I'm largely been, so procedures largely, as we've been discussing, need to have sufficient interest. That's become much more liberal since the early 1990s. Are you a concerned citizen, or are you a poking your nose into what doesn't concern you? So the Miller case shows, which is the Gina Miller case on Brexit, no one had any particular individual concern above another citizen. In those cases, any citizen can probably put in a case. On the other hand, if you've got something which is of a narrow interest, it needs to be somebody from within that interest, not somebody who's taking an objection. So the human rights law, it gives effect to the European Convention within the Guernsey legal system. Basic things to know: it protects certain enumerated rights. It doesn't have a general anti-discrimination clause, but it is actually quite broad, as Article 14. Some rights are absolute. You cannot torture somebody, even if they know where a little boy is slowly suffocating to death. You can't even threaten to slap them to get the information from. And there is a case on that. And the officers concerned got fined €90, and that was held to be a violation of the fundamental right of the murderer concerned.
What was that?
It's a case in Germany. I can't remember the name of it, but it really was taken out of that bit of Dirty Harry. It might as well have been. The boy was already dead, in actual fact. Just as in Dirty Harry, the girl was dead. But it was really a 24 type scenario. And some of the judges said, well, it wasn't allowed, so they've been punished a little bit, and that's enough. And some wanted to take a more purist approach, and the human rights lawyers wanted the guy to go free. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Freedom from slavery, which apparently is going to be argued by our legal profession for having to carry out legal aid obligations. Well, it's been in the papers that they're going to argue it, so I'm not giving anything away, unless they can think of some different argument. Right to a fair trial. You can't get rid of someone's right to a fair trial, but sometimes what can practically be provided does impact on what is a fair trial. So, for example, when it comes to providing legal aid and legal assistance, it is borne in mind that by the European Court, there isn't an infinite amount of money to pay for legal assistance. Non-retrospectivity of criminal law cannot move a single judge, and that includes small £100 fines for tax. So it's got to be on the statute book. It's got to be brought into effect. You can't do what you usually do in tax or can do in tax, which is to announce you're making a change effective from the date of the announcement. You cannot do that with penalties because of Article 7. Other rights are, you can violate them if you can justify them, but that's a proportionality test. So privacy, you can demand to let people tell you what they earn if you're the state because you need that for finance. Freedom of speech, you need not allow people to deny the Holocaust because there's a justification for stopping that.
With proportionality, it's a specific part of the civil contingency law that in respect of this, it gives that legislation gives government in the UK and New Jersey legislation very swinging powers to go and do stuff in the event of an emergency, effectively right offshore over Article 1 of those protocols, like to property and other things. So it's a four-part test, and the fourth part of that test is to have had or legal advice from Her Majesty's Proctor on the proportionality of the proposed act in making regulations to make it lawful to effectively do something.
And some things require very strong justification. So a derogation in time of emergency is something threatening the life of the nation. So in the Belmarsh case, the internment case, A, 2004, that's the one where Lord Hoffman said, the life of the nation is actually being endangered by this law, not by terrorism. And then you have a low hurdle justification, for example, for property rights. There's a matter of fair balance, and often a phrase to be used when it comes to matters of social provisioning, not manifestly without reasonable justification, which should be an almost impossible. It should be almost impossible for social legislation to fail. But the reality is that if the court is willing to cut up the analysis according to the proportionality test, four-stage test, it can very easily make a nonsense of those sort of things like fair balance and not manifestly without justification. So the features of human rights law can lead to changes in customary law. You see with the Guernsey Bailiffs' recent decision in the Jersey Court of Appeal in Fogarty and St Martin's Cottage, which is the ultimate in stupid land boundary disputes. Really is an absolutely incredible case. The duty of the court is to read statutes compatibly, if possible. Section 3 of the law. But you cannot set aside a law on the grounds that it's incompatible. This is the feature of the Human Rights Act to preserve parliamentary sovereignty, and it applies in Guernsey, which is why it seems to be rather incredible to go to the English courts or to any court and say this law cannot be passed because it is contrary to the European Convention on Human Rights, when the statute which incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights specifically gives permission to enact and to keep on the statute book laws which are contrary. There is no fast-track remedial provision in the Guernsey statute, and there's no statement of compatibility procedure, which I find surprising, but there you go, because normally, it happens in Jersey, it happens in the UK. It concentrates the minds of the legislature and the ministers. You have to sign a declaration that it is compatible, and there has to be advice on it, which is ultimately going to have to be given anyway, because you're going to have to explain to the Ministry of Justice why they should agree to the law. Local issues. Now, Andrew Swer, who's the leading academic to come out of the Channel Islands recently, pointed out that proportionality may play different in a small community as opposed to the UK. So the importance of immigration control was the one that he picked out, that it might be more important to control immigration, therefore justifying stricter measures than would be approved of in the United Kingdom. The wonderful misbehaving case on the sex shop in Belfast. It is difficult for a small community because it cannot carry out a full proportionality analysis of all the various options and their economic and social consequences. What we'll often do is say, well, this is what's been done in the UK and it was okay for them, so it must be okay for us. But you can then be criticised. This happened with Northern Ireland and pensions and public pensions. And they say, well, you just copied what they did in England. You didn't actually carry out any sort of analysis. So we're not going to give you any of that judicial deference when it comes to whether or not this was a good or a bad means of securing your legitimate aim. We're going to carry out our own analysis afresh, which suddenly means that the barrier of not fair balance or not manifestly without reasonable justification suddenly gets raised enormously, and you could end up, in theory, with the exact same measure in England and Wales being held to be compatible, and yet in Guernsey, having copied that measure, you could be held incompatible. Which is why it's always very important to ask whoever is promoting the law, why are you doing this? Stop asking me, is this compatible? Ask yourself why you are doing it. Ask yourself, is there a better way of doing it? Administrative Review Board, we're going to have to be quick, unfortunately. The rules are here, but what is the purpose of this review board? I imagine it's exactly the same as its equivalent in Jersey, which is that until comparatively recently, it was unclear whether you had judicial review. Therefore, a complaints board enabled the airing of many of the issues that you get in judicial review, such as the propriety of the decision, is it discriminationary, has the proper procedures been used? Those could be aired in a reasonably formal manner. And it's been retained even though judicial review now applies, because it's actually still quite useful to be able to do this. And the Administrative Review Board can direct committees to reconsider decisions. It doesn't get to actually make the decisions afresh. It doesn't get to strike down decisions. It essentially, it's a means for asking people to think again. It's a means for putting possible maladministration before the states to sort of ask you, do you know what's going on and do you really approve of it? Because ultimately someone is going to have to stand up and justify. And here we have the Dean. The Dean is here. The board comprises 2 states members, Dean of a Dizaine, plus since 2018 reforms, an independent member.
So the 2018 reforms aren't.
They're not in place. So in other words, you don't yet have the filter of the review board. So in other words, most good, that's good.
The filtering process, it's still
Okay. So grounds for complaints. Again, these are all public law sounding grounds. So that's what it was fundamentally originally aimed to do, was to cover the ground that judicial review covers at a time when there was doubt about it. It's now essentially an informal, more political, social way of doing the thing.
Because you sort of have to exhaust remedies before the judicial review, you have to go through this first.
Now, what they're actually, no, you wouldn't have to exhaust this before going for judicial review, because it's not a formal remedy. It doesn't actually give you what you're asking for in judicial review. Because you might do it, but then you would want to be very, very sure that the clock is stopped on the 3 months. But if I was advising somebody, I would say start the judicial review and maybe agree that it becomes adjourned, or the application is adjourned or held to one side to allow the process. I wouldn't want to stop the judicial review process. And if I was a judge and someone said you should have complained to the Administrative Review Board, I'd say that doesn't give you any rights. Because what can happen is you can win under that particular process, and some wise guy can come back and lawyer and draft something which says, we accept most of what you say, except for the bits which are obviously wrong, and the bits that you've clearly misunderstood and violated natural justice yourself. So there you are. And you don't necessarily, so you, as a government, you get to essentially ignore that. If you feel, as happened to me in one particular case, if you read a decision of a review, the Administrative Review Board, in our case a complaints board, and you just think almost every line of this would give me a ground of appeal if this was actually a judicial decision, I can come back and not comply. And so why, given that I'm not, as a administration, bound by this, should the court say that you have to go through this? So I think you can see the practicality.
Let's say the court, probably into the weeds too much. Let's say the court does adjourn the judicial review application pending the results of this. Does it then take the decision of the
No.
as persuasive on some of the issues about the standards are not dissimilar, the ones that are reasonable versus Article 74?
No, because well, not formally. I mean, if you have a question of is something so unreasonable that no decision maker can make it, it becomes harder to reach that particular view the more opinion there are out there it is the right thing. But the reasonableness is a question of law, so entirely not, it has no formal basis. Obviously, it can persuade in the way that any idea can persuade, just as you could. Well, I mean, you could. In a way, you could view it like that. In the same way that if you take an article from an academic article, you can cite that before a court as why they should reach a particular thing, particular decision. It's useful because it provides what's hopefully a coherent set of reasons for why a particular viewpoint is right. I wouldn't necessarily put it any higher than that. Okay, process. Get it? Get what I've put there. 2018 reforms haven't happened.
Yeah.
Okay, statutory appeals. Again, you have statutory appeals, you have to use them. They oust the ordinary jurisdiction of the royal court. So if you have an appeal to a tribunal and the tribunal finds the facts and your appeal to the royal court is only on law, you cannot simply say to the royal court, the tribunal found the facts wrongly. You have to find an error of law. So you have to try and say, well, the facts were perversely found, or there was no evidence to support the finding of facts. So statutory appeals restrict the ordinary power of the royal court. I'm just going to take a very brief break, and then we'll be back for ordinary, and then we should finish ordinary part.
The outcome is most of the cases don't tend to get as far in.
they have to get basically said in their discussions, oh, should we ask the family? And then someone goes,
lots of this new.
Yeah, well, so unfortunately,
Yeah.
all that is post. Basically, the states were like, well, the Fifth Amendment protections. No, the Fifth is due process, and that's both procedural and substantive. So procedural and substantive. So that's just, but that applies to federal government only. That was the, and so all the states to the south.
Well, I'll start thinking more
Or unconstitutional. Post-Civil War, past 14. And the Fifth Amendment protection. So if it's the state government that's doing something, you would go to okay, it's around the but then what's your expense is the exact same. Well, so yeah, it's really. So there's something called. It's so fundamental that it's incorporated. First, we have 3 months. It's so basically, well, how my jury has
yeah, so that's basically
we're going to say that the 16th.
It's actually in skiing season, isn't it? Actually, that's skiing. It's pretty much kind of 16th, 17th. And
Well, you say that. I went last week of March this year. It was when we had the cold thing.
But they
ski weekend I've had actually.
but they closed the bobsleigh. There's a bobsleigh up in that area,
Oh,
and they closed it around the 17th, and the end of that the week. So I did that, the monobob, on the basis that as I didn't have to do anything, it couldn't possibly end in disaster.
Did it?
No, it's perfectly fine. Whereas the bit where you're taken on a hang gliding sort of thing, you still have to stay roughly on your feet at the point you go off the mountain. So that nearly, I was with someone. So that nearly went bad. So the same sort of area.
Was that up with
The plan,
at the top?
Yeah,
I've seen people take up, it's pretty fun.
yeah. We've done skiing 6 or 7 times. Unlike surfing, as you discussed, you can actually get something out of it in a short period of time. Right, so we'll try and go quickly. Right, Alderney is a different country to Guernsey, and so is Sark. They both count insofar as, although not sovereign states, they both count as separate national jurisdictions, although obviously Alderney is very, very much under Guernsey in many respects. Now, despite this basic independence and autonomy, the Royal Court of Guernsey is the first instance court for Alderney, as indeed it is. First instance appeal court for Alderney is indeed for Sark, and certain Alderney trials will take place in the Royal Court of Guernsey. And Alderney, in particular, has placed itself under the legislative jurisdiction of the States of Deliberation in many ways. And therefore, Alderney is represented as an island in the States of Deliberation. That is very much island representation, not representation of the people of Alderney as people of the wider bailiwick of Guernsey. Okay, the short historical background we can make shorter by just skipping that. It is background information, and it's not really necessary to get through the next part in the time that we have. What you get to in the early parts of the 20th century, because that we do need to know, is that all Alderney projects of law were being sent to the Royal Court first. So the Royal Court, which then still had, after all, legislative powers, was acting as a censor for Alderney legislation. So it's not control of the people and the politicians of Alderney, but nevertheless the Royal Court. Now that began to break down in World War I. I'm not entirely sure why, because I would have thought, sending stuff to the Privy Council is more difficult than sending stuff to Guernsey, but there you have it. And in the 1920s, you get to the high point of Alderney's constitutional autonomy within the bailiwick. So the Royal Court is cut out of the picture, but it could set them aside if ultra vires or unreasonable, but that's essentially now having a pure judicial role as the highest court of the bailiwick. So it's the court exercising judicial authority rather than anyone on the island of Guernsey exercising political authority. Nevertheless, Alderney would follow Guernsey criminal law. So, the Royal Court had a residual superintending role, but an ordinary story of democracy, of power flowing to the bodies representing the territory concerned, seems to run its course. But World War II ruined Alderney financially. Alderney was essentially evacuated completely, and the Germans were not good occupiers of the buildings. It was, well, the finance is the thing that particularly. Oh, but at the end of World War II, the Germans are now. Okay, so at the point when the Germans are all sitting in England and in prisoner of war camps, people from Alderney come back, but there's a massive rebuilding operation needs to do. They don't have the infrastructure has been ruined, and the United Kingdom is not inclined to just give the money, because the United Kingdom itself is financially all but ruined by the effort of World War II. So this led to Alderney being essentially placed under the guardianship of Guernsey for many respects. So Guernsey took responsibility for what we now call transferred services. and Alderney gave Guernsey the right to legislate directly. So if you're essentially going to be treating Alderney as part of your country for the purposes of providing these services, then your authorities and your legislature is going to have an equivalent role. And if, of course, Guernsey is going to be stumping up the cash, then it needs to know that money is being well spent, and that Alderney is not essentially being given a free ride. So essentially, although Alderney keeps its original sovereignty and that the whole of this arrangement depends on the continued existence of an Alderney law that transfers the functions, and therefore Alderney could, in theory, leave, it would have to know that it could actually replace the services done by Guernsey. It would have to have a plan, and perhaps not invite Theresa May to run it at the time. So there we are. The Alderney application of legislation law. States of deliberation can legislate for Alderney in the following areas, which are very, very extensive. So Alderney pays Guernsey taxes, and Guernsey meets deficits in Alderney's public finances, which obviously means that Guernsey has an inherent interest in the running of those public finances.
Mid-1990s, the financial balance was about equilibrium. All the taxes Guernsey was receiving from residents was sufficient to meet the services, probably with the exception of the running of the airfield, was sufficient to meet it. The Lloyd's crash actually was probably had the biggest impact on Alderney. There seemed to be an awful lot of Lloyd's names for some reason living in Alderney, so tax receipts literally plummeted from one year to the next, and it's been significantly in deficit ever since. At the moment, in the next couple of weeks, I'll check to say that there is currently a review of the 1948 agreement. It's got all of them very, very exercised. It's a bit like where we are generally with coming out of the EU. Instead of aspecting a protocol free, if we were negotiating that now, we wouldn't get nearly as good a deal of how the bad deal with the protocol free is for Guernsey. Alderney recognises that actually they might like some aspects of the 1948 agreement, but when now it's up for review, they're going to get nearly as much out of it.
So it's the fundamental truth that they lack the resources to sustain themselves.
Yeah.
Lloyd's crashing Lloyd's.
Lloyd's of London. Yes, right. Yeah. That really.
Because some very rich people lost an awful lot of money.
And there were quite a few Alderney London residents who were paying a bunch of money. That's why they moved to Alderney. The tax purposes and something. What year is that?
It was it happened in the late 80s, early 90s. It wasn't a single crash. It was essentially the calls on the names got higher and higher and higher, because a lot of them, essentially, it was a spiral of people with the different syndicates backing each other up. So when you had Piper Alpha was one of those things, but I think the thing that actually did them for Lloyd's the most was the United States retrospective environmental legislation, which created liabilities, and then decided that it would be a nice idea if American companies didn't pay for them, but that insurance policies should cover retrospective the imposed loss, providing insurance companies are outside the US. That is. And Scalia was the only US judge to actually go against it in usual trenchant fashion. So
Knowledge.
What?
Knowledge.
So, Ordinay's relationship with the states of deliberation sends two representatives. We said that a lot. In practice, elected annually by the states of Ordinay. So they
The people.
are they?
The election, the two representatives will be, who's like next? Yeah. It's a contested, sometimes it's contested election, so 2 weeks' time, it will hold again, and voting who they want.
They have to be representatives in members.
They have to be members of the
Yeah.
of the state board, and then nothing. Basically, they appoint two, and the representation board will allow, so if somebody's unwell or for that reason can't get there, they can play such.
Mhm.
Probably 3 years ago, there was a question on bar exams which related to whether or not the ordinary representative was entitled to be in the states. And that day it was kind of.
You know, it's actually going to be very important that whoever sets it does actually talk to us, because if it hasn't been taught, it can't go on the paper. No, that has to be an absolute rule. What's not taught can't go on the paper. So it has to, even if it is to say, if we put up an article with an idea and it's there on the website, it's legitimate, however harsh it might be. You can draw from that article, and you can draw ideas from that article. If, on the other hand, you have something which simply is not to be found, or indeed something which is unfortunately contradicted, because again, you don't get this necessary. This is why you're here, because this piece of knowledge are not there leaking out of the states of Ordinary or the states of Guernsey websites.
Yeah, I was doing some private tutoring and I don't know the answer to that. And it took me some time to find the answer. It's quite complicated. It's a very flexible process.
Because the idea is just that you have two people there from the states of Ordinary. That's all that Guernsey is interested in, and that there's a properly accredited one. It has no interest in the system.
So when you make when
the bottom line is that the bailiff needs to be informed and stuff.
so if one of the two or the two on the website are available, but another Albany deputy wants to attend, they just
My mind is like the question is something around the normal website was stuck in off.
yeah.
And another member of the happens to be on the list.
Yeah.
So don't worry, that's I'll go along.
Yeah. Which makes
practical sense. Yeah. And had the right person on the bailiff, but did was going as opposed to the result well.
So there is something in the legislation that
Yes,
provides
yes,
for those
yes.
circumstances.
Yeah, procedures. Not immediately assigned.
Okay, so the states of Ordinary today, 10 members elected 4 years, but half every 2 years re-elected. There is a people's meeting before the states sits in order to try and explain things. Which again, it shows what you can do in a small community that you perhaps can't do in a bigger one. And it is indeed possible for an ordinary resident to speak at the States Assembly, although obviously not to get too involved in the debates and not to actually vote. Quorum of 7. It has a committee system, although I can't imagine you need to. It must be quite small committees, or it's going to be the entire house. Yeah, and it has a chief executive and a treasurer. So the same idea. Project de Loi go up to the Privy Council for approval. But one of the things is that the law officers of Guernsey vet them in order to ensure that they're not going to be bounced back for non-compliance with the Privy Council's criteria. So the legal advice that's necessary comes from Guernsey because it doesn't exist in Alderney itself. And there are ordinances for good government, but they are restricted as to what they do in terms of affecting people's rights. There's a statute which regulates what can be passed in terms of ordinances. Instead of us in Guernsey, which just simply been a customary law matter, it's never been properly defined. So restrictions, transfers.
What do you mean they can't do it?
You can't authorize someone to go into somebody else's house. So the basic rules that you need to know: transfers of functions to Guernsey, so you can't really legislate where functions have been transferred. You can't legislate where functions have been transferred. World Court can declare ordinances ultra vires. As primary legislation, it can be struck down. Ordinances contrary to orders in council are void, which means that they are treated as never having happened, and that has to be the case because an order in council is a higher form of law and therefore always took priority. Now, SARC. We have a court of this. Unfortunately, yes, we don't have Gordon. He's the expert on SARC. Might disagree with him on some points, though. The Court of the Seneschal is the sole court in SARC. Chief Pleas is its parliament. So it is in the nature of a national legislature. That's what's specifically recognised by the English Court of Appeal in one of the Barclay cases, before people woke up to the idea that the English Court of Appeal shouldn't be involved at all. L'approbation extends to it. Indeed, it extends to Alderney as well. So A versus R is an example of that. Now, because SARC has much less legislation than even Guernsey, a lot of what now is statute law in Guernsey will still be customary law in SARC, which means all the problems of having a customary law jurisdiction with little case law is going to positively race in that particular jurisdiction. Democratization. Formerly Europe's last feudal state, in that political rights were tied to the ownership of particular pieces of land. So I think there was 40 tenants essentially ran the place. And the Barclay brothers didn't like this undemocratic state of affairs. And the challenge is made, and it was decided early in the 2000s that it needed to democratize. The right to vote, which we talked about earlier, was obviously not being upheld in a society where the vote is tied to property. So we needn't go through the lengthy ins and outs of how they came to the present system. The people of SARC actually were fairly loath to abandon all link with the past. And in many ways, providing they had a regular chance to reaffirm it, they're perfectly entitled to choose. And they would have thought a quirky, strange way of life. But I think they particularly wanted it because it would actually, they thought, keep the Barclay brothers at a greater arm's length if power was held by 40 tenants rather than by the population as a whole. Well, I suppose then the Barclays would have bought up all the tenants, wouldn't they? Yes. So you end up with A, where you have the incredibly high number of 28 people's representatives, which makes it sound like people's representatives and people's deputies. It does begin to sound like a communist in terms of the nomenclature. But originally 28 members of the Chief Pleas, which is a very high percentage of the actual island when you think about it. In fact, a higher percentage of the island than you say vote in parish elections. So, all legislative and executive functions in the chief police or its committees. The Seigneur's veto was abolished in 2016. The Royal Court can annul ordinances, but again, that's a legal function. Same thing, ordinances contrary to orders of council are void. And you have a committee to make provisional ordinances if the procureur, HM procureur, i.e. law officers here in Guernsey, agree that it's necessary or expedient. Unlikely to really happen in practice, I suppose. Maybe some stuff to do with animals and agriculture. And the one imperfection in Guernsey's legislative sovereignty, apart from UK, of course, states of deliberation can legislate without consent on criminal matters. Because on crime, massive crime, it's historically always been largely run out of Guernsey. But it's particularly important because it's hard to get a unbiased trial together in a small jurisdiction, and even harder to get a prison. So their composition of chief police, that is how it is. So it only meets 4 times a year normally. Presumably it met recently. Yeah, to keep the lights on. So essentially, SARC, despite being 500 people, is a little national democracy all on its own. And the difficulty, I think one of the things that Gordon mentioned, is that the way in which they do the elections of essentially whoever comes highest in the ballot paper, because obviously SARC does effectively have a political party, which is the list favoured by the Barclay brothers, and everybody else not on that list is essentially the other political party. So you have the issue that if you simply have the people who are highest, if you have 18 votes for people on the list, the 18 people who come on the list will all, if you have parties, all be of the same party. So you don't actually have minority representation, the minority view representation. So to the extent that the Barclays are upset because they don't win elections, there's no validity to that complaint. To the extent to which they're upset because they go up unrepresented, there is some validity to that complaint. When you think about how democracy should work. And I think that's all you need. I think the main thing is these are different jurisdictions. SARC has much more independence, and Ordinary, for some reason, has been unable to sustain itself. I suppose if SARC's economic difficulties become so great as to unsustain the population instead of just losing population, it can happily lose population. It's if it can't pay for all who remains, it's a problem.
Crunch, the decision of last week to affect the problem over the electricity supply was that it was electricity being supplied by a family-owned company, had been since 1947, and but people decided that the electricity was ridiculously high. The company said we can't do it for any less, and they appointed the Creative Legislation Commissioner to look at the price, and he fixed the price by dropping it by 14 pence per kilowatt unit. And we can't take the losses, we haven't got the money to different funds to appeal the Commissioner's decision. Please get us some money so that we can effectively go to court and challenge your Commissioner's act. Now, the position is that two police have reached a settlement with the site electricity company, and are now looking to buy the company out. It's whether or not they have the reserves to be able to carry through that. You know, or how they haven't got sufficient in reserves, how they get the people of stock to pay additional taxes.
There are many jurisdictions in the world which impose on their residents a worldwide wealth tax. And actually, often that's wealth for quite a low percentage above a quite high sum. So if you had a SARC worldwide wealth tax on assets above £1 million at 0.1%, you would actually get everything you need, but only 2 people would pay. And what you have left over, you could use to pay to compulsorily purchase certain closed businesses within SARC as well.
It's one where the movable force has met the resistible object.
I think sometimes what you need is low down cunning, though, don't you?
The lights will stay on.
Well, it's made national news in the UK. But light stayed on.
The lights stay on, that's the main thing.
Well, I always say to my wife, my ambition is to move to SARC.
I don't have that in my life as well.
Okay, so you go down to
I must say, it goes down only slightly better than my plans to move to St Helena or to the Falkland. St Helena I could do if I really wanted to.